There is a sentence in the oldest part of the Bible that almost nobody reads carefully. It is one line long. It sits in the middle of the flood story, in a chapter people have been reading out loud for something close to 3,000 years, and it contains 3 words that quietly break the entire narrative. Picture yourself somewhere very old tonight, a room cut into rock, cool even in summer, the way stone rooms always are. A single lamp. In front of you, a scroll unrolled across a table. Not a book, a scroll. Heavy, the edges soft as cloth from handling. The language is Hebrew. The hand that wrote it has been dust for millennia. The passage describes a world before the flood. It says there were giants on the earth in those days. The Hebrew word is Nephilim. And that they were born to the daughters of men after the sons of God came down to them. Mighty men, men of renown. And then the sentence adds 3 more words, and also afterward. That's it. No explanation, no elaboration. The text simply notes, in passing, as though it were nothing at all, that the giants were there before the flood, and also after it. Remember those 3 words. We come back to them at the end of the night, because everything else in that chapter insists on the opposite. The whole point of the flood, as the story tells it, is that everything is wiped away, every living thing on the face of the ground. And yet 600 years and several books later, when the spies come back from the land of Canaan, they report, in a state of open panic, that they saw the Nephilim there, that the people were of great size, that they felt like grasshoppers in comparison. And later still, there is a king called Og, of a place called Bashan, and the text tells us he was the last of a people called the Rephaim, and then does something no other passage in the Bible does. It gives you a location. It says his bed, made of iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, is on display in the city of Rabbah. Go and look, the text says, if you don't believe it. There is a word for what you are about to spend the next 2 hours with. The technical term is crux. In textual scholarship, a crux is a place in a document that doesn't resolve cleanly, where the standard readings leave something unexplained. The "and also afterward" in Genesis 6:4 is a crux that has been sitting in the open for 3 millennia. Generations of careful readers have passed it, noticed it, and moved on. Tonight you're not going to move on. There is also this. The tradition didn't ignore the problem. The ancient readers who encountered this sentence were not less attentive than we are. In many cases, they were far more attentive. These were people who read the same texts daily, who argued in detail about single words, who understood the difference between Nephilim and the various other words the tradition had available for large or powerful peoples. They noticed, and what they did about it is the most interesting part of tonight. A book that spends a chapter drowning the world, then spends 5 more books pointing at the survivors. So that's the question we're going to follow, slowly, all the way down tonight. If the flood ended them, how did the giants survive it? And what did the people who noticed this contradiction, thousands of years ago, actually write down to explain it? Before we go further, let me say something. You don't need to follow every word tonight. Some of this will reach you, and some of it won't, and that's exactly how it should be. The question we are carrying isn't urgent. It has been sitting unanswered for 3,000 years, and it will still be there when you fall asleep. Close your eyes if you would like. You can drift. This is for a specific kind of person, for the ones who notice the small sentences. For anyone who has ever stopped in the middle of a familiar story and thought, wait, that doesn't fit. If that's the experience that brought you here, you're in exactly the right place. Close your eyes if you like. If you're already drifting, let it carry you. You can come back to any part of this another night. There's no failing at sleep. One question before we begin. Where in the world are you tonight? And what hour is it where you are? Someone is in Nairobi just after midnight with the temperature dropping. Someone is in Vancouver with the rain on. Someone in Seoul, someone in Dublin, someone who can hear a dog somewhere outside. Leave it in the comments. I read them all in the mornings, and I like knowing where this reaches. And if this is the kind of night you come here for, a quiet tap on like or a subscribe, that's all I need. The rest of the night is yours. Let me start with what the text actually says, not what you've heard about it, not what any tradition or interpretation has made of it, just the text itself. Read slowly, the way you'd read a document you found in a drawer and weren't quite sure of. The 6th chapter of Genesis opens on a world that has become crowded. The sons of God, that phrase in the Hebrew, B'nai Elohim. And it has been argued over for 23 centuries without resolution, and we'll come to what the argument is in a moment. See the daughters of men, and take them as wives. Children are born of this union. And then comes the sentence. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went in to the daughters of humans, and they bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. That's Genesis 6:4. And embedded inside it is the first puzzle. Nobody is entirely sure what Nephilim means. The word appears only twice in the entire Hebrew Bible, here and in Numbers 13. The root is almost certainly connected to the Hebrew verb naphal, to fall. This gives you two main interpretive directions: beings who fell, in the sense of having descended or been cast down, or beings who caused to fall, in the sense of being overthrowers or attackers, something formidable that makes others fall before them. There is a minority tradition that reads it as a noun meaning those who were born, derived from an Aramaic usage. Most modern scholars lean towards some form of fallen ones, or those who fell upon others. But lean is the right word. The text doesn't define its own term. It uses Nephilim and moves on. For most of the English-speaking world, the giants entered this story through a translator's choice made approximately 23 centuries ago. In the 3rd to 2nd century BC, a group of Jewish scholars in Alexandria, working at the instruction of the Ptolemaic court, producing what became the oldest surviving Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures, encountered the word Nephilim and rendered it as gigantes, giants. The translation is called the Septuagint, and it became the Bible of the Greek-speaking Jewish world, then the early Christian world, and every English Bible you have ever read traces its word giants back to that single choice. The Hebrew text doesn't say giants. The Greek intermediary does, and every reader downstream of that Greek has been reading Nephilim as giants ever since. This matters because it means the specific image we carry of these beings, the towering, superhuman figures of popular imagination, comes to us through a translation. The Hebrew original is far less specific about what they were. They were the Nephilim. They were there, and also afterward. Now hold this, and hold it carefully. The B'nai Elohim. The sons of God. Who are they? This phrase alone has generated a literature of interpretation that stretches from the ancient world into the present. Three main positions have been maintained across Jewish and Christian traditions. The oldest reading, attested in the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Septuagint, the Book of Enoch, and early Christian writers including Justin Martyr and Origen, takes to B'nai Elohim. Literally, these are divine or semi-divine beings, members of the heavenly court, who came down and took human wives. This is a reading that sits comfortably with other ancient Near Eastern mythologies, where the divine and human worlds overlap in exactly this way. It is the reading that makes the Nephilim make sense. They are the hybrid result of a union between the divine and the human. A second reading, prominent in later Jewish interpretation, takes B'nai Elohim as referring to the sons of nobles or rulers, powerful human men rather than supernatural beings who took wives from among common women. This reading removes the supernatural element entirely and makes the passage about human hierarchy and perhaps about intermarriage between different groups. The Nephilim, on this reading, are simply the children of the powerful. A third reading, influential in Christian interpretation from roughly Augustine onward, takes Bene Elohim as the descendants of Seth, the righteous line of humanity, who corrupted themselves by intermarrying with the descendants of Cain. The Nephilim are the result of this mixing of righteous and unrighteous lineages. Each of these readings produces a different story. The first gives you something close to what the ancient extra-biblical literature assumes. The second and third make the passage entirely about human affairs. What's most interesting for our purposes is not which is correct. Scholars continue to debate that, but that the ambiguity was noticed and argued over as early as the 2nd century BC. The gap in the text is ancient, and the awareness of the gap is ancient. Which brings us to the other element of Genesis 6:4 that most people don't notice, or notice and pass over without pausing, and also afterward. In the Hebrew, vegam akari ken. And also after that, and also subsequently, 3 words in the middle of a sentence that say, "These beings were there before the flood, and they were also there after it." Most readers pass over these words at something close to reading speed. They feel like a clarification, a parenthetical, a small rhetorical gesture. The Nephilim were there before, and also after, and here is what they were. But the only afterward that could exist in the chronology of these chapters is the aftermath of the flood. The flood is coming in the next 2 chapters. When Genesis 6:4 says, "and also afterward," it is describing the period that follows the event it's about to describe, which is the destruction of all life on the face of the earth. Every living thing, every human being except Noah's family, every beast and bird and creeping thing. The text is emphatic about the completeness of this destruction. It is one of the most sweeping statements in the Hebrew Bible. And also afterward, the period between roughly 300 BC and 100 AD that historians call the Second Temple period was one of the most intellectually active in Jewish history. The texts we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, the books of 1 Enoch and 2 Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Psalms of Solomon, these were produced in this period by communities of readers who took the inherited texts with great seriousness and who argued, debated, wrote, and rewrote in response to what they found there. These were not careless readers. Many of them were people for whom the Hebrew Scriptures were the most important documents in existence. They noticed the seams, they noticed the gaps, they noticed and also afterward, and unlike us, they did something about it. They wrote books. The 1st century of the Common Era, in the world of Second Temple Judaism, was a period of enormous literary and theological productivity. The community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls was writing. The authors of the Book of Jubilees were writing. The community that eventually produced what we know as the Mishnah and the Talmud was in the earliest stages of the oral tradition that would eventually be written down. And among all this writing, the problem of the Nephilim and the flood was a live one. Why? Because the texts that contained both sides of the problem were not separate books on a shelf that you could choose to read one without the other. They were a single scroll, or a set of scrolls, that was read beginning to end. If you were a serious reader of what we now call the Pentateuch, you would read Genesis chapter 6 in the morning, and Numbers chapter 13 in the afternoon, and Deuteronomy chapter 3 the following week, and the pieces would all be present to you simultaneously. The contradiction was not something you could avoid by staying in one corner of the library. The Second Temple period is roughly the centuries between the construction of the Second Jerusalem Temple, which dates to around 516 BC, and its destruction by the Romans in 70 AD. During this period, Jewish communities were scattered across the ancient Near East and the Mediterranean, in Alexandria, in Babylon, in Rome, in the land of Israel itself under successive Greek and Roman administrations. These communities read the same texts, argued about the same problems, and produced an enormous variety of interpretive literature in response. Some of that literature has survived. Some has been known since antiquity. Some vanished and was recovered at Qumran. And some was probably lost entirely, leaving only the traces of the arguments it responded to. The Book of Enoch is one of the survivors. The Book of Jubilees is another. And the Book of Giants, the one we're going to spend the most time with tonight, the one that tells the story from inside the giant's perspective, that one very nearly didn't survive at all. When Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian who wrote for a Roman audience, describes the Nephilim in his Antiquities of the Jews, he's already translating the problem into something his readers can grasp. He describes them as having souls of the most contemptible kind and who were violent men, confident only in their bodily strength. He's doing what interpreters always do, taking the raw, unexplained word in the source text and giving it a gloss that makes it fit the world the reader inhabits. Every generation that has read the text has glossed it. What's different about the Second Temple glosses is that some of them survive in the text themselves, not as marginal notes, but as whole books. There is one more thing worth knowing about the Second Temple context before we go further into the evidence, and it has to do with the B'nai Elohim, the sons of God who came down to the daughters of men in Genesis 6. In the Jewish interpretive tradition, this phrase took on very specific weight, because the answer to who they were determined the answer to what the Nephilim were, and the giants, as a theological category, were inseparable from the explanation of their origins. The ancient interpreters who read the B'nai Elohim as literal divine beings, members of the heavenly court, supernatural in nature, were the ones who produced the Enochic literature. The Book of Enoch takes the B'nai Elohim, reading seriously, names the fallen ones, gives them roles and histories, and explains the Nephilim as the hybrid children of that union. This reading produced the most extensive and the most imaginative literature around the problem. The interpreters who read the B'nai Elohim as powerful human men produced a different set of texts that tended to moralize about the corruption of the powerful, about the dangers of marriage between social unequals, about the ordinary human mechanisms of how evil enters the world. These texts are less dramatic. They are also less likely to be read in the middle of the night. But before we follow those books, we need to follow the pattern further into the text itself, because Genesis 6:4 is not alone. What comes after it, in Numbers and then in Deuteronomy, is not a passing mention, it is a pattern. And one part of that pattern includes something that belongs in a museum, not a law book. A physical object, with a specific location, in a named city, and an invitation to go and look for yourself. In a few minutes, when we open Deuteronomy, you'll find the only address in the Pentateuch, a museum label inside a legal code. The Book of Numbers is the fourth book of the Hebrew Bible, and most of it reads like what it is: a long administrative record, census data, tribal listings, rules about offerings. It's not a book most people read for mystery or for pleasure or for anything except the sense that they are supposed to have read it. Which is why what happens in chapter 13 is so easy to miss when it arrives without announcement in the middle of what feels like logistics. Moses sends 12 spies into the land of Canaan. This is a reconnaissance mission in a straightforward military sense. Go see what's there, what the land is like, whether the people are strong, whether the cities are fortified. The spies go. They come back 40 days later with figs and pomegranates and a single enormous cluster of grapes, which 2 of them carry between them on a pole. Then they give their report. The land is good, they say. It flows with milk and honey. The cities are large and fortified. The people are strong. And here is where the register of the text shifts gear. The people include the descendants of Anak, and they add, "We also saw the Nephilim there, The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. The flood, in the chronology of these texts, is several generations in the past. The spies are reporting in what is structured as a military intelligence assessment with names, locations, produce yields, fortification levels, size of the population, that they have seen the Nephilim, not a myth, not a memory. They saw them. And then comes the line. One of the spies adds something that has stayed in the language for 3,000 years. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them. Notice the structure of that sentence. It's not a metaphor deployed for literary effect. It reads like a soldier's report, the retrospective description of what it was like to stand in front of something and feel the proportions shift under your feet. The panic in the phrasing is genuine. These men went looking for strategic intelligence and came back frightened in a way that only certain things make you frightened. The text doesn't treat this as miraculous. It doesn't mark it as extraordinary. It places it inside a field report, alongside the data about fortifications and produce, and moves on. The grasshopper line is the human response to an operational reality. And then the question the text doesn't answer. If the flood destroyed everything, and the text of Genesis is emphatic that it did, how are the spies looking at the descendants of the Nephilim in Canaan, hundreds of years later? The text moves on. The spies' report causes a crisis in the camp. God responds. The chapter ends. The Nephilim and the Anakim have served their narrative function, and the text does not go back for them. But the next book does, and it does it very strangely. Deuteronomy is Moses' final address to the Israelites before they cross the Jordan. He is reviewing history, reminding the people of everything that happened in the wilderness. And in chapters 2 and 3, he does something that feels out of place in a speech. He stops the narrative to provide an annotated geography of tall peoples. The Emim formerly lived there, he says, speaking of the land of Moab, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. Like the Anakim, they are also counted as Rephaim, but the Moabites call them Emim. And then of Ammon, it is also counted as a land of Rephaim. Rephaim formerly lived there, but the Ammonites call them Zamzummim, a people great and many, and tall as the Anakim. But the Lord destroyed them before the Ammonites, and the Ammonites displaced them and settled in their place. The Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzummim, the Zuzim, the Anakim. 5 names, each attached to a specific people, in a specific territory, with notes about their size, their relationships to one another, and who eventually displaced them. It reads not like mythology, and not like rhetoric. It reads like a comparative ethnographic note in the margin of an administrative document. Someone is making sure that the record is complete. In a law book. This is the detail that tends to slide past when people read Deuteronomy, because Deuteronomy is primarily a legal text, the framework for how the people are to govern and worship and conduct themselves. The tall peoples appear in the territorial overview as data points. Here is who was here before you. Here is who displaced them. Here is what you need to know about the peoples adjacent to your territory. It is practical information, and it is delivered practically. And then chapter 3, verse 11. This is the one that doesn't still belong, or rather, that belongs so completely to another genre that its presence in Deuteronomy feels like a mistake. It isn't a mistake, but it feels like one. Moses has just described the defeat of Og, king of Bashan. Og is identified as the last of the Rephaim, the last survivor, in some sense, of the category of peoples that has been running through these chapters, the last remnant. And then the text adds, in a parenthetical that has the grammatical structure of a footnote, for only Og, the king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaim. Behold, his bed was a bed of iron. Is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? 9 cubits was its length, and 4 cubits its breadth, according to the common cubit. 9 cubits by 4. At the standard measurement of approximately 18 inches to a cubit, that is a bed 13.5 feet long by 6 feet wide. And then, is it not in Rabbah of the Ammonites? Go and look. If you don't believe it, go to Rabbah. The bed is there. We are going back for the bed in Rabbah at about an hour and a half tonight. Remember it. But first, let's understand what it's doing here. This is a museum label. It is, structurally and rhetorically and functionally, the same thing as a small placard mounted beneath a display object. Iron bed of Og, king of Bashan, 9 cubits by 4, currently in the city of Rabbah of the Ammonites. An invitation to verify the claim with physical evidence. Nothing else in the 5 books of Moses does this. Not once does the Pentateuch point at a physical object in a specific city and invite the reader to go and check. This is the only time. What exactly was the object? The scholars have not agreed, and the possibilities are genuinely interesting. The simplest reading is what it says: a literal iron bed frame of exceptional size, kept as a trophy or a curiosity after Og's defeat. In the ancient Near East, the beds and furniture of defeated kings were sometimes displayed as trophies, the way military standards or royal regalia might be displayed. An iron bed in Rabbah could simply be the bed of a conquered king, kept on exhibit in the city that had once been hostile to Israel. A second reading involves basalt. Basalt is a dark volcanic stone extremely common in the region of Bashan, the very region where Og ruled. In Hebrew, the word for iron is basal. And some scholars, noting the geographic context, have argued that in this particular passage, basal may describe dark, heavy stone rather than the metal, in the same way that some languages use color terms for materials. A large basalt sarcophagus, a coffin-shaped stone container of exceptional dimensions, displayed as a trophy in Rabbah, fits the archaeological record of the region. The third reading, proposed by scholars working with the megalithic archaeology of the Levant, is that the bed was a dolmen, one of the large stone structures formed by 2 or more upright rocks, topped with a horizontal capstone, of which hundreds survive in the Bashan region and the Golan Heights. Dolmens are genuinely enormous structures, often weighing many tons, and later, peoples encountering them frequently couldn't explain who had built them. The assumption, repeated across cultures, is that whoever built structures this large must themselves have been large. A dolmen measured at approximately 9 cubits long would fit naturally into the tradition. None of these readings is certain. All of them are documented positions in the scholarly literature. What's certain is that the text believes the object is real and verifiable, that it provides a city where you can go find it, and that the object has since been lost. The city of Rabbah is the city we now call Amman, the capital of Jordan. It has been continuously inhabited since the Bronze Age, which means that whatever might have been there has been built over and over and over. The address is real. The object, if it existed, is gone. Scripture has handed you a museum label for an exhibit that closed 3,000 years ago, which means that anyone reading Deuteronomy in the 2nd century BC, or the 1st century BC, or the 1st century AD had exactly the problem you have right now. 3 data points that should not coexist. Genesis saying the Nephilim were there also afterward, Numbers saying the spies saw them hundreds of years later, and now Deuteronomy naming 5 peoples of exceptional size, with specific territories, specific histories, and at least one object that you could in principle go and see. This isn't one anomaly. It's a pattern. The sensory detail in Numbers 13 is worth pausing on. The spies don't just report numbers and fortifications, they bring back produce. The single cluster of grapes carried between 2 men on a pole has been in the tradition long enough to become proverbial, the grapes of the promised land, the sign of abundance. It's a detail that functions as evidence of the report's authenticity. These men were there, they saw the land, they brought back what they could carry. And then, inside the same evidentiary report, they say they saw the Nephilim. The text does not treat this as a different category of claim. The grapes are evidence. The Nephilim are evidence. Both appear in the same field assessment. This is what makes the Numbers passage so interesting from a textual perspective. The author, or the tradition that preserved this account, doesn't flag the Nephilim claim as extraordinary. It doesn't say, and also strangely they reported seeing Nephilim. It sets the claim inside the structure of the report, as naturally as it sets the information about the grape clusters. The ancient reader was expected to read them at the same level of facticity. Whether we do so is a different question, but the register of the text doesn't help us distinguish. Let's stay in Deuteronomy 2 for a moment longer, because the passage is more specific than it usually gets credit for. Moses isn't just listing large peoples in a general way. He's providing what reads like a key to the ethnographic map of the region, a guide to who was where, and what each group was called by the people who knew them best. The Emim, he says, were called that by the Moabites. Their actual name, or the name the Moabites used, was the Emim. Elsewhere they might have been called something else, the Rephaim. Similarly, the Ammonites called their predecessors the Zamzummim, and both the Emim and the Zamzummim are described as being like the Anakim in size and number. The text is doing something careful here. It's preserving the local names, the names each people used for the large peoples they displaced, while also providing a key that connects them all to the category the Israelite tradition calls the Rephaim. This is the kind of detail that gets lost in summary. When people discuss the giants of the Bible, the discussion tends to collapse into a single image, large, powerful people who were defeated. But Deuteronomy 2 is telling you something more specific. Each of these peoples had a name, and the name varied by who was doing the naming. The Rephaim were the Emim when you were Moabite. They were the Zamzummim when you were Ammonite. They were the Anakim when you were Israelite. And in Genesis they were the Nephilim. One tradition, many names. Or, and this is the seam theory reading, multiple traditions, multiple peoples, all gathered under the umbrella of the Nephilim category because they shared the quality of largeness and the quality of having been there first. Og is the culminating figure in this catalogue. He's introduced at the end of chapter 2, when Israel defeats Og, king of Bashan, the last king in the sequence, and he returns in chapter 3 for the notice about his bed. The sequence matters. The catalogue of tall peoples, their territories, and their fates leads to Og as its final entry. He is the last of the Rephaim, the last identifiable survivor of the category, and his defeat is the exclamation point at the end of a long argument about who was in the land before Israel and what happened to them. And then, immediately after describing his defeat, the text mentions the bed. The juxtaposition is deliberate. You've just read that Og was the last of his kind. And then the text adds, here is something of his that you can still go and see. It's almost as though the author anticipated skepticism. The catalogue of tall peoples is impressive but abstract. Names, territories, a general claim about size. The bed is concrete. It has dimensions. It has a location. It answers the implicit challenge. You say these people were extraordinary. Prove it. There's the bed. 9 cubits by 4. Rabbah. The text is as close as ancient literature gets to saying, go fact-check me. What would it have meant to actually go to Rabbah in, say, the 3rd century BC? Rabbah was a real and functioning city. It had been captured and recaptured by various powers. It had changed names more than once. But it was there, on the map, reachable. If you were a curious reader, with the means to travel, you could have gone. You could have looked for the iron bed. Whether anyone actually did, we don't know. The text doesn't record any such verification. What it records is the invitation. And if you were a careful reader in the ancient world, you had exactly the same cognitive dissonance you are feeling right now. And unlike us, some of those readers couldn't leave it alone. In a few minutes, we're going to look at the 3 lenses through which thoughtful people have tried to read this pattern, because there's more than one honest answer to the contradiction. And then we're going into a text that did something extraordinary. It wrote the story from the other side. Before we go deeper into the ancient answers, it's worth doing what careful readers do, turning the text around and looking at it from more than one angle. Because there's more than one honest way to interpret what we've been following. And some of the most interesting things about it become visible only when you try all three lenses. The first lens is the one most historians of the Hebrew Bible would reach for, and it deserves to be taken seriously, because it's the one that is probably closest to the truth. The Hebrew Bible was not written in one sitting. This is not a controversial claim among scholars. It's the conclusion of several centuries of careful textual analysis, and even among communities of faith that hold the Bible to be divinely inspired, the view that it reached its final form through a process of composition, collection, and editing across many centuries is widely held. The evidence for it is in the text itself. The flood narrative contains what appear to be two interleaved versions. In one, God instructs Noah to take 7 pairs of clean animals and 1 pair of unclean ones into the ark. In another, it's 2 of every kind. Both instructions are followed in the text. Both versions of the story are present, woven together by an editor who felt the obligation to preserve both. The Nephilim references on this reading are seams. The Bene Elohim story in Genesis comes from one tradition, with strong parallels in other ancient Near Eastern mythologies. Stories of divine beings and human women, and the hybrid children of that union. The giant peoples of Deuteronomy, the Rephaim, the Emim, the Zamzumim, the Og tradition, come from a different tradition, or several traditions, preserving the memory of peoples who were experienced as large by the people who encountered and fought them, encoded in the way that folk memory encodes the overwhelming. These two traditions were assembled into a single text, and the result was a contradiction that the final editors either didn't notice, or chose not to smooth over, or felt was not theirs to alter. This is not a diminishment of the texts. It's the opposite. Seams are how you can see the sewing. They tell you that the people who assembled the Bible were conserving material they had received, not fabricating material they preferred. And also afterward is a trace of the joining, and the joining is evidence of care, of a scribal tradition that took seriously its obligation not to lose what it had been given. The cool stone of this reading is in the attention it requires. These editors were not careless. They knew the texts well enough to weave two flood traditions together without losing either. If the contradiction survived, it survived because they decided to let it survive. The second lens is literary and historical, and it's the one historians of the ancient Near East tend to apply across the whole genre of writing we are working in. In the ancient Near East, describing your enemies as giants was common, not metaphorically common, rhetorically, politically, and literarily common. When the authors of Numbers describe the Anakim and report the spies' experience of smallness, they are using a rhetorical register that runs through the literature of the entire region. The enemy is enormous, we are tiny, and therefore, what we overcame was an extraordinary achievement. This is partly propaganda, partly genuine cultural memory of standing in front of walled cities that seemed impossibly large, or of encountering peoples who were on average taller than you, or of finding ancient ruined structures that no living memory could account for. The megalithic monuments in the region of Bashan and the Golan Heights are real. There are hundreds of dolmens in that region, and they are genuinely enormous, some weighing many tons, requiring coordinated labor to construct that most small communities of the period could not easily have managed. A pastoral community encountering these structures would have no way to know who built them or when. The natural conclusion, when faced with a stone construction larger than anything you could imagine your own people producing, is that it was built by people larger than your people. That assumption, repeated across generations, becomes tradition. Tradition, written into inherited accounts, becomes text. The tall peoples of Deuteronomy 2, on this reading, are the accumulated memory of peoples the Israelites found when they arrived. Peoples who built large, who held their territory, who seemed formidable in the way that established peoples always seem formidable to those arriving. The Rephaim and the Zamzumim and the Emim are real peoples remembered with territorial specificity and ethnographic detail, filtered through a framework that expressed their impressive size by the only vocabulary available, the vocabulary of the Nephilim. The third lens is the one the ancient readers themselves used, and I think it's the most interesting of the three, not because it's more accurate, but because of what it reveals about how human beings have always responded to an inherited account that doesn't quite add up. Second Temple Judaism, roughly the period from 300 BC to 100 AD, did not have access to source criticism. The people writing in this period did not know that the text had been compiled from multiple traditions across many centuries. What they had was one holy text, and in that holy text was a genuine logical gap. The flood destroyed everything. Other passages documented survivors. These were not, to the Second Temple reader, separate traditions that happened to coexist in the same scroll. They were two parts of a single sacred document, and they had to fit together, because the God who inspired the document would not have put contradictory things in it. So they wrote books, the Book of Enoch, the Book of Jubilees, the Book of Giants. These are not supplements in any dismissive sense, and they are not forgeries. They are earnest attempts by highly educated and deeply serious people to close a logical gap in inherited material. They used the tools available to them: narrative elaboration, the filling of gaps with plausible content, the extension of received story into uncharted territory, in the same way that any careful reader is tempted to extend a story that has a hole in it. What those solutions look like is what the rest of tonight is about. But here is the pause before we cross the threshold that this topic requires. And I want to be direct about it, because the honesty here is what makes the rest of the night worth having. None of what follows is history in the modern sense, and it is not accepted as such. The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees and the Book of Giants are ancient Jewish religious and literary texts. They are not archaeological evidence. They are not scientific accounts. They do not constitute proof that giants were real, or that the flood happened as described, or that any of the supernatural events they narrate occurred in the physical world. Mainstream historians and archaeologists treat them as what they are: literary elaborations of an older tradition, produced by a specific community in a specific period, valuable for what they tell us about Second Temple Judaism, but not as records of literal events. What they are is the oldest surviving serious attempt to answer the question in tonight's title. They were written by people 2,000 years closer to the texts they were interpreting than we are, and the question they were asking is the same question you've been carrying for the last 35 minutes. That is genuinely remarkable, and it's where we're going. The seam theory deserves a full elaboration, because it's the most intellectually satisfying of the three readings, and the one that makes the Bible feel most like what it actually is: a very old, very careful human document. Biblical scholars working in the tradition called the documentary hypothesis, a theory developed primarily in the 19th century, refined throughout the 20th, and still the dominant framework in academic Old Testament scholarship, propose that the Pentateuch was assembled from several distinct source documents, usually labeled J, E, D, and P, corresponding roughly to different periods, geographic locations, and theological emphases in ancient Israelite history. The J source, so called because it uses the personal name Yahweh for God, is generally thought to be the oldest, possibly composed in the 9th or 10th century BC in the southern kingdom of Judah. The E source uses the more generic Elohim for God and may originate in the northern kingdom of Israel. The P source, the priestly source, is generally dated to the exilic or post-exilic period and is concerned with genealogy, ritual, and precise measurement. D, the Deuteronomistic source, is the voice behind most of Deuteronomy. On this reading, The flood narrative itself is a weave of J and P, which is why it contains what appear to be two versions of certain instructions. The Nephilim in Genesis 6:4 come from one of these strands. The giant peoples in Deuteronomy 2-3 come from the D source, from a different tradition of Israelite historical memory, possibly encoding genuine memories of peoples who were encountered in the land before and during the settlement period. When these strands were assembled into a single text, the editorial decision was made, consciously or unconsciously, to let both stand. The "and" also afterward is, on this reading, a trace of that assembly. A phrase from one strand that registers the existence of large peoples in the post-flood world, placed inside a passage from another strand about the pre-flood world. In a way that produces a logical gap, the assembler either didn't notice or didn't feel was theirs to fill. This reading is not a diminishment. It makes the editors of the Bible extraordinarily human, careful custodians of received material, working with the deep conservatism of scribal tradition, preserving what they had been given, even when what they had been given didn't fully cohere. There is another dimension to the literary lens that's worth dwelling on. The word Rephaim, which appears in the Deuteronomy catalogue and elsewhere, has a second meaning in the Hebrew Bible. Rephaim also means shades, the dim, diminished ghosts of the dead in the Hebrew concept of the afterlife. They inhabit Sheol. They are explicitly described as beings of lesser presence and power than the living. The Rephaim of Deuteronomy are enormous, fearsome people. The Rephaim of the Psalms and of Job are barely their shadows in the underworld. Are these two usages of the same word related, or are they separate words that happen to be spelled the same? Scholars have argued about this for a long time without reaching consensus. Some propose that the giant peoples were associated, in Israelite imagination, with the dead or the underworld, a connection that would make them liminal figures, belonging to a world adjacent to, but distinct from, the ordinary human one. Others think the overlap is accidental, two different words, two different meanings, that converged in the writing system. The ambiguity is real, and it means that when you read about the Rephaim in Deuteronomy 2, you are reading a word that simultaneously refers to large peoples on the landscape of Canaan and to the shadow selves of the dead in the underworld below it. Whether the ancient author intended both resonances at once, we can say. But both were available. The third lens, the ancient reader's lens, has its own dimension that deserves more attention than it usually receives. When we say that Second Temple Judaism wrote books to close the gap, we sometimes imply that the gap was a problem they failed to fully solve. But that may be the wrong way to look at it. The texts they produced, Enoch, Jubilees, the Book of Giants, are not desperate patches. They are imaginative, carefully constructed, theologically sophisticated works that engage with the problem on the problem's own terms. The question of how the giants survived the flood is answered in 1 Enoch by a theory of dual nature, spirit and flesh, that is genuinely philosophically interesting. The answer in Jubilees, 9/10 bound, 1/10 permitted, is a piece of theological arithmetic that takes both the flood's effectiveness and the world's ongoing brokenness seriously. The Book of Giants doesn't answer the survival question at all, but instead asks a different and more interesting question. What was it like to be the giants, knowing what was coming? None of these answers is the same as any other, and the fact that the tradition produced 3 different answers to the same question tells you something important. The question was taken seriously. The writers of these texts were not embarrassed by the gap. They were energized by it. That energy is what we are going into now. The Book of Giants is not the easiest text to access. It exists in fragments. It requires scholarly reconstruction, and the fragments themselves are in Aramaic that has to be translated. But the effort is worth it, because it contains, in the pieces that survive, something that I think is genuinely unlike anything else in the literature of this period. It gives the giants interiority. It gives them an experience of what's happening to them. It gives them dreams. It gives them fear. It gives them each other, and a journey, and a question they can answer alone. And then it gives them the answer they weren't hoping for. The ancient literary tradition of the giant enemy runs deeper than the Hebrew Bible alone. In Mesopotamian mythology, the Etlu, the mighty man, the warrior of renown, is a stock figure whose power is expressed through physical scale. In Egyptian literature, the enemies of Egypt are sometimes described in ways that make them feel superhuman. In Greek mythology, the Gigantomachy, the war between the Olympian gods and the giants, is one of the foundational stories of divine order asserting itself over chaos. And the giants are enormous in the way that all threats to order need to be enormous. This does not mean the Nephilim are the same as the gigantes of Greek mythology. It means that describing powerful, threatening peoples in terms of exceptional size was a literary and cultural reflex across the whole ancient world. When the authors of Numbers and Deuteronomy reached for the vocabulary of largeness to describe the peoples they encountered, they were reaching for a vocabulary that their entire cultural world made available for exactly that purpose. The extraordinary thing about the Hebrew tradition is not that it uses this vocabulary, every tradition did, but that it uses it with such specific ethnographic detail. The Rephaim are in this territory, the Amim are in that territory. The Zamzumim were displaced by the Ammonites. The specificity grounds what could have been pure rhetoric in something that feels like memory. Whether the memory is accurate in a historical sense is a separate question from whether it reads, in the text, like memory. And it does. One of those books does something none of the others do. It tells the story from inside the experience of the giants themselves. It gives the giants names. It gives them dreams. It gives them a journey. We're going in. In November of 1947, a young Bedouin shepherd in the Judean desert threw a stone into a cave above the northwest shore of the Dead Sea and heard clay breaking inside. He and a companion climbed in and found what would eventually be recognized as one of the most significant archaeological discoveries of the 20th century. The Dead Sea Scrolls, nearly 1,000 texts, most fragmentary, some nearly complete, belonged to a Jewish community at Qumran that had sealed their library in clay jars sometime around 70 AD, when the Romans arrived to suppress the Jewish revolt and destroy the Second Temple. Among those texts were many that the scholarly world had known only by name, or by quotation in other works, or not at all. One of the ones it knew almost not at all was the Book of Giants. What archaeologists recovered from caves 1, 2, 4, and 6 at Qumran, catalogued in the scholarly system as 1Q23, 2Q26, 4Q203, 4Q530, 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 4Q23, 2Q26, 4Q23, tooth leather fragments, some no larger than a hand, some smaller, a few words wide in some cases, entire sections gone, lines that begin and don't finish, names that appear without enough context to be certain of their role. A story told as much through what's missing as through what survives. Pause here, if you can, and feel the physical reality of that. A story about beings that the tradition describes as enormous, surviving in scraps you could hold in your cupped palms. There is something in that proportional irony that the tradition would probably have appreciated. The oldest fragments are dated to approximately the 2nd century BC, contemporary with some of the later books of the Hebrew Bible itself. The text was clearly in circulation before it arrived at Qumran, because versions of it were carried east across Asia by the Manichaean religious movement centuries later. Mani, the 3rd century prophet who founded Manichaeism, incorporated the Book of Giants into his own sacred literature and gave it to his followers, who translated it and carried it along the Silk Road into Central Asia and eventually as far as the oasis city of Turfan, in what is now the Xinjiang region of western China. Fragments in Middle Persian, Sogdian, and Uyghur were found there in the early 20th century. A story that began in the Judean desert eventually circulated across half the ancient world. What it tells, in the fragments we can reconstruct, is this: the Watchers, the beings called Bene Elohim. In Genesis, the sons of God, here given the Aramaic name Irin. Watchers or watchful ones have already made their descent and their unions and their children by the time the Book of Giants begins. The children are the giants, and the Book of Giants is, insofar as we can assemble it, the story of those children in the period just before the flood, specifically of what they began to experience and to dream as the flood approached. Think about what that sentence means for a moment. Someone, 22 centuries ago, decided that this story deserved to be told from inside the experience of the giants themselves. The cast of the Book of Giants, as best we can reconstruct it, is small but distinct. Two figures appear with enough frequency across the fragments to be clearly central: Ohia and Hahia, who the text identifies as sons of the watcher Shemihaza. They are brothers. They appear together in several of the better preserved fragments, and they seem to function as something like joint protagonists, the figures through whose perspective the story is experienced. There is a third figure who plays a different role: Mahaway, son of the watcher Barakel. His role is less clearly central to the dream narrative, but he eventually becomes the hinge on which the whole story turns. Hold his name. And then there is one more name. One name in the fragments that should not be there, or rather, that is there in a way that no one who first encountered it expected. In the fragments catalogued as 4Q530, among the more substantial pieces recovered, covering several lines of continuous text, Gilgamesh appears by name as one of the giants. Gilgamesh, the hero of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving work of literature in human history, a king of Uruk from the early centuries of Mesopotamian civilization, whose story involves a flood and a survivor, and the question of what is available to human beings in the face of time and loss. A figure from Sumerian and Akkadian mythology who predates the Hebrew Bible by more than 1,000 years. Listed in a Jewish religious scroll found in the Judean desert as one of the children of the Watchers, as one of the giants, not as a parallel, not as an echo or an allusion or a comparison, as a character with a name, alongside Ohia and Haya, among the beings who will appear in the story that follows. Someone writing or assembling the Aramaic Book of Giants in the 2nd century BC had read or heard or was in some way aware of the great Mesopotamian epic, and decided, on literary or theological or cultural grounds, that its hero belonged in this story. The ancient world was porous in ways we don't always appreciate. The membrane between literary traditions was thinner than the modern separation of cultural archives suggests. The hero of the oldest surviving human narrative was absorbed into a Second Temple Jewish text about the children of angels as naturally as water finds a crack. If you're still with me at this point in the night, and I know some of you have drifted, which is exactly right, you can come back to this part. I want to ask you something. What's the strangest thing you've ever found in a text you thought you knew? A detail that had been there all along, that you'd read past a dozen times that suddenly looked entirely different. Leave it below if you're still awake. I read every comment, because what comes next in the Book of Giants is the part I find hardest to leave. The giants begin to dream. The fragments are damaged enough that we can reconstruct the full sequence, but what we have is sufficient to understand the nature of the dreams. And the nature of the dreams is extraordinary. They are not triumphant visions. They are not visions of power or dominion. They are visions of erasure. In what appears to be the most complete description of a dream that survives in the fragments, a vision is sent to Ohia or Haya, perhaps to both, in which figures come down from the sky. An angel descends carrying a tablet. The tablet has names written on it, and the angel begins wiping the names away. The names are being deleted. The record is being cleared. All the names except one line. One line of names is left on the tablet, and the rest are gone. The giants wake from this dream frightened. They gather. They discuss what the dreams mean. And here is the detail that makes the passage so strange and so human. They don't know. These beings, the enormous children of divine fathers and mortal mothers, the ones who had been present on the earth with tremendous power, are experiencing visions of their own annihilation, and they are as confused by them and as frightened of them as any person is frightened by a dream they can interpret. One name was not wiped off that tablet. Hold on to that. Written 22 centuries ago, the dream in the Book of Giants reads like something contemporary, a document being deleted, a record being cleared, the names going one by one, and the terrible attention to which ones remain. The giants, faced with dreams they can understand, reach the same conclusion anyone might reach. They need someone who can interpret, someone with access to what the dreams mean, and they know who that person is. Enoch. In the tradition we are working in, Enoch is the great-grandfather of Noah. In Genesis, he receives a few lines and one extraordinary sentence. He walked with God, and he was not, because God took him. He did not die, he was taken. This made him, in the Second Temple imagination, a uniquely significant figure, the human being who had been given direct access to divine knowledge, who had traveled to heaven and returned with information. The Book of Enoch, a much longer text, found in more complete form among the Dead Sea Scrolls, is attributed to him and contains extended visions of the cosmos, of the coming judgment, of the structure of the divine world. In the Book of Giants, the giant's best and only hope of understanding what the dreams mean is Enoch, and so Mahaway is sent to find him. The text says he flew. The relevant fragment is damaged, and the precise word is the subject of scholarly debate. But the most coherent reading of the passage has Mahaway moving through the air, flying, traveling in a way that covers the distance between the giant's location and wherever Enoch is, in order to reach the one person who can interpret the vision, a being born of two worlds, Heavenly Father, human mother, flying to the ends of the earth to find a human scribe and to ask him to explain a dream. Slow this down if you can. Let the image settle. This is the emotional center of everything we've been building toward. The giants, beings of extraordinary power and terrifying presence, who had been on the earth in those days and also afterward, who had lived in ways and at scales the tradition could barely describe, are going to a man, asking for help, because the dream has frightened them in a way they can resolve alone. There is something in the trajectory of that journey, the giant traveling to the human, the powerful seeking the wisdom of the small, that the author of the Book of Giants made central to the story. It didn't have to be this way. The story could have been told without Mahaway's journey, without the flight, without the specific act of going to Enoch. The author chose to make it this way, chose to put the moment of dependence at the center of the giant's final days. When Mahaway returns, he carries Enoch's answer. And Enoch's answer, in the fragments we can reconstruct, is not reassurance, it is a verdict. The dreams are true. The names being wiped away are the giants' names. What they have been dreaming is what is actually coming. The tablet that came down from the sky, the names disappearing from it. This is not a warning that something might happen. It is a report of something that has already been decided. The Book of Giants ends here, effectively, not in water and fire, because the flood itself is not described, but in this, the return of the messenger with the news that cannot be changed. The ending has already been written. The names are already being erased. Before we can follow the Book of Giants into the giant's experience, we need to understand the physical context of what was found, because the physical context is itself part of the story. Cave 4 at Qumran is the most significant single site in the whole Qumran excavation. Located in the cliff face directly across from the main Qumran settlement, it was evidently the community's primary library cave, the place where their manuscripts were stored in the largest quantity. The cave was not discovered by archaeologists. It was found by Bedouin treasure hunters in 1952, who extracted material before the official excavations could catch up. This means that the material from Cave 4 reached the market in an uncontrolled way, was purchased through intermediaries, and required years of painstaking reconstruction before scholars could even determine what they had. What they had was extraordinary. Over 15,000 individual manuscript fragments from a single cave, approximately 400 different manuscript texts, material ranging from well-preserved pieces to scraps smaller than a postage stamp. And among those scraps, the pieces of the Book of Giants. The fragments were distributed across multiple caves, not just Cave 4, but also Cave 1, Cave 2, and Cave 6. The distribution suggests that the Book of Giants was not a marginal text, not something the Qumran community kept in a single location as a curiosity. It was a text that circulated, that was copied multiple times, that was present in different parts of the community's collection, a text that mattered to them. The Manichaean connection amplifies this. When Mani founded his religion in 3rd century Babylonia, a syncretic faith that drew from Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, and Christianity, and that would eventually spread from the Mediterranean to China, he incorporated the Book of Giants into his canon of sacred texts. He didn't use it as a reference or a comparison. He made it his own, rewrote portions of it, gave it to his followers as scripture. The Manichaean Book of Giants is not identical to the Qumran Book of Giants. It has been adapted and extended. But the core story, the core characters, and the core dream vision survive, and the Manichaean missionaries who carried it east were among the most successful missionaries in antiquity. The text went places most ancient Jewish literature never went. W.B. Henning, the scholar who first identified and published the Manichaean fragments from the Turfan excavations in the 1940s, recognized that the story in those Middle Persian and Sogdian texts was the same story that had been recovered from the Judean desert. The same giants, the same dreams, the same structure. A story that traveled from a cave in the desert to the oasis cities of the Silk Road, passing through multiple religions and multiple languages across a span of perhaps 5 or 6 centuries. That's the document we're working with. Fragmentary, widely traveled, important enough to be carried to the other end of the ancient world. Now let's go inside it. The opening sections of the Book of Giants, the sections we can reconstruct with any confidence, establish the world after the Watcher's descent. The giants are already on the earth. They are already enormous. And they are already, in the fragments we have, in the grip of something they don't understand. Ohia and Hahia appear with enough regularity that it's clear they are central figures. Brothers, sons of Shemahazah, who is in other Enochic texts the leader of the fallen Watchers, the one who organized the descent, the one who first proposed taking human wives. Ohia and Haya carry their father's significance. They are not peripheral giants. They are among the most important, what we can see of their personalities, to the extent that personality survives in fragmentary text, suggests they are not villains in any simple sense. They are beings caught in a situation they didn't choose and can escape. Their fathers made the choice to descend. The giants exist as the result of that choice. And now they are dreaming of its consequences. Mahaway is a stranger kind of figure, less central to the dreams, less prominent in the fragments that survive from the earlier sections. But he becomes the hinge of the story's second movement, the one who moves, the one who crosses the boundary between the giants and the human world, the one through whom the answer comes back. And Gilgamesh. Let's stay with Gilgamesh for a moment, because the appearance of this name in a Second Temple Jewish text is one of the most striking pieces of evidence of how the ancient world worked. The Epic of Gilgamesh was composed in Sumerian before the 3rd millennium BC, older than the pyramids, older than the events described in the Hebrew Bible, older than almost any other surviving literary tradition. It was translated into Akkadian by at least the 18th century BC and became one of the most widely copied texts in the ancient Near East. Libraries excavated at Nineveh, at Megiddo, at Ugarit, at Hattusa, the Hittite capital in what is now Turkey, all contained versions of the epic. It was, in a meaningful sense, the most widely distributed literary work of the ancient world before the Bible. Its hero, Gilgamesh, is a king of Uruk who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a proportion that early readers might find interesting in the context of the Nephilim tradition, though the parallel shouldn't be pushed too hard. He is of extraordinary size and strength. He is a king. He has a companion, Enkidu, who was created by the gods to be his equal. And at the center of his story is an encounter with death, a flood, and a survivor. The Babylonian Noah figure, Utnapishtim, who was given immortality after surviving the Great Deluge. The structural resonances between the Gilgamesh epic and elements of the biblical tradition have been noted and debated since the tablet was first translated in the 19th century. The flood story in particular is so close in detail. The divine decision to destroy, the single chosen survivor, the construction of a vessel, the release of birds, the landing on a mountain, that scholars have been arguing for a century and a half about the relationship between the two traditions. What the Book of Giants does with Gilgamesh is something different from noting a parallel. It puts him in the story as a character. It gives him a name, a place in the genealogy of the giants, a role in the narrative. It makes him Ohia and Hahia's contemporary. It absorbs the most famous hero of Mesopotamian literature into the frame of the Jewish giant tradition as naturally as you might absorb a famous historical figure into a novel set in their era. This tells us something about the authors of the Book of Giants. They were not insular. They were reading or hearing the literature of the wider ancient world. They were comfortable bringing figures from other traditions into their own. The ancient intellectual world was porous, in a way we tend to underestimate from our position inside a world of sharp national and religious boundaries. A Sumerian king of mythological antiquity was absorbed into a Jewish text about the children of angels as if he had always been there, and in the Book of Giants he had always been there. Now let's get to the dreams, because the dreams are the emotional core of the Book of Giants, and the thing that has stayed with me since I first read a translation of the relevant fragments. The dreams begin with Ohia, or possibly both brothers receive versions of the same dream. The fragments are damaged enough that the sequencing is uncertain, and different scholars have proposed different reconstructions, but the content of what is dreamed is consistent across the pieces we have. An angel descends. He is carrying a tablet. The tablet has writing on it, names, a record, and the angel begins to erase what is written. The names are wiped off the tablet one by one, or perhaps in groups, until only a small amount remains, a single line, or a single column, of names that have not been erased. The giants wake from this dream in distress. The fragments show them gathering, discussing, trying to make sense of what they've experienced. They understand that the dream is significant. In the ancient world, dreams were understood to be communications from the divine realm, messages that required interpretation. They understand that something is being communicated to them about their fate, but they can read it. The language of the dream is divine language, and they need a translator. Hold on to this detail. One line of names was not wiped off the tablet. One line survived the erasure. We will come back to what that line contains. The giant's response to the dreams is what happens in any tradition when powerful people don't understand a sign they know is meant for them. They seek interpretation, and they know where to find the interpreter. Enoch, in the tradition that the Book of Giants is embedded in, is the human being with the most direct access to divine knowledge. He had walked with God and been taken. He had seen the structure of the cosmos. He had come back, in the Enochic literature, with visions and measurements and the specific details of heaven's geography. If anyone could read a dream sent from above, it was Enoch. The problem is that Enoch is not nearby. The text implies that he is at the ends of the earth, or at least at a great remove from where the giants are. And so someone has to go and get him. Mahaway goes. The text describes his journey in terms that most translations render as flying. The relevant fragment is partially damaged. There's a word whose precise form is debated. But the most coherent reading has Mahaway traversing the distance between the giants and Enoch through the air, covering enormous ground in a way that normal human travel wouldn't allow. He is a giant, and whatever his specific abilities are in the text's cosmology, he is capable of a journey that humans couldn't make. The trajectory of the journey matters, a being born of the divine-human union, flying toward the human side of that equation in order to receive a message from the divine side. Mahaway moves from the world of the giants, who are enormous and powerful and terrifying, but who cannot read a dream sent from God, to find a human scribe who can. This inversion is not accidental. The author of the Book of Giants made it central. The giants have power in every physical and worldly sense. They are bigger. They are stronger. They have been present on the earth in ways that the tradition remembers as awesome, and they are going to a human being with a question they cannot answer themselves. When Mahaway arrives at wherever Enoch is, he presents the case. He describes the dreams. He asks for an interpretation. Enoch gives him one. The answer is the verdict. The angels, the text says, or something close to this in the reconstructed fragments, have asked for you to be destroyed, and your request for mercy has been denied. What you dreamed is true. The tablet is being wiped. The bodies will not survive what is coming. Mahaway takes the answer back to the giants. The Book of Giants ends here, effectively. Not with the flood itself, the water and the drowning, but with this, the return of the messenger with the news that the account is already closed. The story doesn't need to show the ending. We already knew the ending. We knew it from Genesis. The point of the Book of Giants was never to change the ending. It was to give the ending interiority, to show what it was like, on the inside, to know that the ending was coming. The giants knew. They dreamed it before it happened. They sent someone to find out if the dream was true. They received confirmation that it was. And the text ends there, with the confirmation still fresh in the messenger's hands. That is the story of the Book of Giants, as best we can reconstruct it from what survives. It is a story about the experience of unavoidable endings, about the specific terror of knowing what is coming and being unable to prevent it, about going to find an answer and receiving the answer you hoped not to receive. It was written in the 2nd century BC, for readers living under occupation, watching their traditions and their institutions slowly come under pressure from a world that didn't share their values. They knew something about unavoidable endings. They knew something about sending messengers and waiting for the answer. They gave that experience to the giants, and through the giants they gave it to you. There is a detail in the Mahaway flight passage that scholars continue to debate. The question is whether Mahaway flew himself, or whether he was carried, by a wind, by an angel, by some vehicle the text implies but does not specify. The difference matters because it says something about what kind of being Mahaway is. If he flew himself, he has abilities that suggest the divine component of his nature is operative in a way that allows movement through the air. If he was carried, he is more passive, a messenger who needed transport. Most reconstructions lean toward a reading in which Mahaway himself is the subject of the verb of movement. But the damage to the fragment leaves this genuinely open, and the openness is part of the texture of the Book of Giants. A text full of passages that give you the outline of something without its full resolution. This is, in a way, appropriate for a text about giants. The giants themselves are partial, half divine, half human, fully neither. The text about them is partial, fragments, lacunae, possible words where certain words should be. The fragmentary nature of the document mirrors the fragmentary nature of what it describes. Someone wrote this down in the 2nd century BC, wrote it for people who lived in occupied territory, whose temple would be destroyed within a few generations, who had already watched the Maccabean revolt and its aftermath, and had reasons of their own to understand what it felt like to see your world being cleared away. They gave that experience to the giants. They wrote the giants as beings who dreamed of their own erasure before the erasure came. We are about to go to the deepest part of tonight, the part where the texts get very still, where the argument stops and the image begins, because the destruction of the body, in these traditions, was never the same thing as the end of the giant. Let everything go quiet for a moment. The first book of Enoch is a long and complex document. It was composed in stages across several centuries, assembled from multiple visionary and apocalyptic sources, and it covers an enormous range of material: the movement of the stars and the calendar, the structure of heaven, the nature of the divine court, the fate of the righteous and the wicked, and the underlying causes of what the ancient world experienced as the persistence of evil in a created world that should, by rights, have been good. In chapters 15 and 16, there is a passage that answers tonight's question, not partially, not as allegory, directly and specifically, in a voice that addresses the situation with the precision of someone who has thought it through and arrived at a definite answer. The passage is addressed, in the text, to the Watchers, the fallen divine beings who fathered the Nephilim, and it explains, carefully and slowly, what their children actually are. The giants, 1 Enoch says, were born of two natures. Their fathers were spiritual beings, members of the heavenly host, beings who exist in a realm where there is no hunger and no thirst and no physical decay. Their mothers were human, mortal, made of matter that ends, subject to the full range of physical limitation and physical death. And this double nature, spiritual father, human mother, created something that had never existed before, a being that was not entirely either thing, not entirely spirit, not entirely flesh. When the flesh dies, 1 Enoch says, the spirit does not. The text reads, in translation, "But now the giants who are born from the union of the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits upon the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling." Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they are born from humans, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on earth, and evil spirits shall they be called. And later, the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offences. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men, and against the women, because they have proceeded from them. The spirits of the dead giants remain on the earth. They don't go somewhere else, heaven or a realm of the dead, or any of the destinations the tradition offers to ordinary human spirits. They stay here, on the earth, in the world, after the flood. After the flood, after the silence, after the survivors come down from the ark and the birds find dry land and the rainbow appears and the world starts over, they remain. This is the answer, the Enochic answer to the question we've been carrying all night. And it is an answer that makes sense only once you understand what a being of dual nature actually is. The flood worked, let that be clear. The flood did what it was supposed to do. It removed the bodies. It drowned the giants. The water rose, and the giants drowned with everything else that drowned, and their enormous physical forms went under the water and did not come back up. The flood was not a failure, but the body was only half of what the giant was. The spiritual half, inheriting the indestructibility of the Watcher Father, had no body to drown. The water that dissolved the flesh had nothing to do with what the flesh had contained. In this cosmology, the flood removed what water can remove. The rest stayed. Deliver this gently. This is not a horror story, and it doesn't some benefit from urgency. The horror, if there is horror in it, is in the slowness of the thought. A world cleaned by the greatest catastrophe the tradition could imagine, and the thing it couldn't touch was precisely the part that didn't have flesh. The word 1 Enoch uses, evil spirits, is often read as a description of malevolence. In context, it may say more about homelessness. These are beings that belong nowhere now. Their fathers, the Watchers, are bound, imprisoned, awaiting judgment. Their bodies are gone. Their world was the pre-flood world, and that world is underwater, and they are here, on the earth, after. The cool stone of that image, at this hour, a world that looks the same as the one before the flood, and something in it that the flood couldn't touch, and neither did the flood's aftermath. I need to pause here, because this is where the safety valve matters most. 1 Enoch is a religious and literary text. It is not a scientific account. It is not archaeological evidence. It does not constitute proof that giant spirits walk the earth, or that the flood happened as described, or that anything in 1 Enoch's cosmology has a correspondence to physical reality. Mainstream scholars read it as theology in narrative form, a sophisticated ancient attempt to explain why the world remains broken after an event that should have fixed it. The evil spirits of the Nephilim are 1 Enoch's explanation for the persistence of harm and disorder in a post-flood world that should, by any logic, have been clean. This is a theological answer to a theological problem, and it should be understood as such. What it tells us about the people who produced it is something more interesting than any claim about literal giant spirits. It tells us that they were asking hard questions about theodicy in a period when hard questions were warranted. The Second Temple world was not a comfortable world. It was occupied territory, subject to empire after empire, with a history of destruction and reconstruction and destruction again. The question of why things don't get better after the worst happens was not an abstract question for the people who wrote 1 Enoch. It was the question they lived inside. The evil spirits of the Nephilim are their answer, and it is an answer that takes the flood seriously as a real event with real consequences, while also refusing to pretend that the consequences solved everything. Now, something else deserves our attention before we come back up. Something I planted at approximately 95 minutes tonight. Hold on to a fraction. 9/10. We'll need it in about 12 minutes. But first, the giants get taller in the retelling. This is demonstrable, and it's one of the most interesting small facts in the whole tradition. When most people read the story of David and Goliath in 1 Samuel, they encounter a figure described as 6 cubits and a span. At 18 inches per cubit, that's approximately 9 feet 9 inches. Superhuman. The kind of height that makes David's victory feel like a miracle against impossible odds. But 6 cubits and a span is not what our oldest manuscripts say. Among the Dead Sea Scrolls is a text known as 4Q Sama, a fragmentary copy of the Book of Samuel, dated to the late 1st century BC or early 1st century AD. It is roughly 1,000 years older than the Masoretic manuscripts for this passage. In 4Q Sama, Goliath's height is 4 cubits and a span, approximately 6 feet 9 inches. The Septuagint, the Greek translation whose choice of gigantes, for Nephilim, we've already discussed, also reads 4 cubits and a span. Josephus, the 1st century Jewish historian who describes the encounter in his Antiquities of the Jews, gives the same number, 4 cubits and a span. 3 witnesses, all older than or independent of the Masoretic tradition, all agreeing on a height of 4 cubits and a span, approximately 6 feet 9 inches, still large, still notably tall, but within the range of human variation, not superhuman. Between our oldest witnesses and the later standard text, Goliath grew by 2 full cubits in the transmission, by approximately 3 feet. The Masoretic 6-cubit Goliath is a later, amplified version of a figure who was already large by any ordinary standard in the earlier texts. The direction of the drift is the interesting part. The giants grew in the retelling. As time passed and the tradition accumulated, the figures in the story became larger. Not smaller, not the same, larger. This is what memory does with towering opponents. This is what tradition does with the thing that felt overwhelming. It makes it more overwhelming. Not in bad faith, but in the way that a story about a great fish gets the fish slightly larger with each telling. The amplification is a feature of transmission. The giants grew in the retelling. The retelling is now what most of us read. The passage from 1 Enoch 15 to 16 is not long. It occupies a few pages in most translations, but it is one of the most carefully argued passages in the whole Enochic tradition, and it deserves to be read in its full logic. The setup is this. Enoch has been transported, through a vision, into the divine presence. He has delivered the Watcher's petition, the one we encountered earlier in the tradition, and the divine response has been the refusal. No mercy for the Watchers, no mercy for their children. What is coming is coming. And then, in the context of explaining why no mercy is possible, the text provides a precise account of what the Nephilim actually are, not as a digression, as an explanation of why their situation is unique, why the usual provisions don't apply to them. The key is the dual nature. The Watchers, the text says, were pure spiritual beings, members of the divine order, existing in a realm where there is no eating, no drinking, no physical need or limitation. They lived eternally in a way that required nothing of the physical world. The humans they took as wives were the opposite, entirely mortal, entirely physical, limited to the body's lifespan and subject to the body's needs. The giants born of this union were something the created order had never contained before, beings that had both natures simultaneously. They needed to eat. They had human bodies with human hunger. But they had the spiritual nature of the Watcher Fathers, which was not subject to ordinary death. This is the cosmological problem that the flood could solve only halfway. The bodies could drown. The bodies were subject to physical death in the way human bodies are. But the spiritual component, inherited from the father's line, not from the mother's, was not. And so after the bodies drowned, something remained. The spiritual nature of the Watcher Fathers, which had no body to inhabit anymore, stayed on the earth. Because where else would it go? The Watchers themselves were bound, imprisoned, awaiting judgment. The giants' spirits couldn't poo up because up was closed, and they couldn't go to the underworld in the way ordinary human spirits did, because they weren't ordinary human spirits. They had too much of the divine about them to fit the human afterlife categories. They stayed on the earth, as something the text calls evil spirits. The logic here is genuinely sophisticated. It's not just asserting that spirits survived, it's explaining, in terms of the internal consistency of the cosmological system, why they had to survive. The flood solved the physical problem. The physical problem was the bodies, violent, destructive, consuming everything. Remove the bodies, problem solved. But the spiritual problem was insoluble by physical means, because the spirits don't have bodies to remove. 1 Enoch is doing the same thing Jubilees does, but with a different instrument. Jubilees uses arithmetic, 9/10 bound, 1/10 remaining, to navigate between the flood's effectiveness and the world's ongoing brokenness. 1 Enoch uses metaphysics, dual nature, the indestructibility of the divine component, to explain why the flood could only do part of the work. Both are genuine attempts at logical consistency. Both are working within the rules of the system they inhabit. And both arrive at the same conclusion. The flood worked, and something still remained. And the two facts are compatible if you look carefully at what the flood could and couldn't do. The description of what the spirits do after the flood is also specific. They hunger but don't eat. They retained the need without the capacity, because the body that eating would satisfy is gone. They afflict, they cause trouble, they attack the living. The text isn't giving them a romantic or sympathetic existence after death. It's giving them something much stranger, an existence defined by the absence of what defined them in life. The giants were beings of enormous appetite and physical power. After the flood, they have the appetite without the physicality, and the power without the body to express it. Homeless. That's the word I keep returning to. 1 Enoch's evil spirits are homeless in a way that has no resolution available to them. Not in the world of the living, which they haunt but can fully inhabit. Not in the world of the dead, which can receive them. Not in the divine realm, which has expelled their fathers. They are in the between. Settle into that image if you can. The cool stone around you, the lamp lower than it was, the kind of stillness that comes at the deepest part of the night. A world that looks exactly like it did before the flood. The same hills, the same rivers, the same sky, carrying something the flood couldn't touch, carrying the remainder, the part that had nobody to drown. This is what the ancient imagination made of the and also afterward. Not a mistake, not a slip, an explanation, worked out in careful detail, of how the text could say what it said and still be true. Now, let's go to Goliath, because the Goliath detour isn't a detour. It's the piece of evidence that shows us something crucial about how these traditions work across time. The story of David and Goliath is one of the most familiar stories in the Bible. Everyone knows its shape. The small shepherd against the giant warrior. The sling. The stone. The victory that no one expected. The story's power is entirely dependent on the disproportion. David's smallness against Goliath's largeness. Without that disproportion, the victory is impressive, but not miraculous. Without that disproportion, the theological point that God works through the unlikely doesn't land. So the story needs Goliath to be enormous, and the Masoretic text, which became the standard of the Hebrew Bible from roughly the 7th to 10th centuries of the Common Era, gives you a 6-cubit Goliath, 9 feet 9. That is a figure whose height makes David's victory feel cosmologically significant. But the manuscripts we have that predate the Masoretic tradition don't give you that Goliath. 4Q Sama is a Dead Sea Scroll fragment, found in Cave 4 at Qumran, the same cave system that contained the Book of Giants, dated to approximately the late 1st century BC or early 1st century AD. It is a copy of portions of the Book of Samuel, and when it reaches the Goliath story, it reads 4 cubits and a span, 6 feet 9, still tall, notably unusually tall for the ancient Near East, where average male height was probably around 5 feet to 5 feet 4. A warrior of 6 feet 9 would be formidable, and in single combat on an open plain between armies, terrifying, but not supernatural. The Septuagint, again, roughly 3rd to 2nd century BC, also reads 4 cubits and a span. Josephus, writing for a Roman audience in the 1st century AD, describes Goliath as 4 cubits and a span. These three witnesses are independent of each other and all predate or run parallel to the Masoretic tradition. They all agree on a much smaller figure. The trajectory of the drift, from 4 cubits to 6 cubits, from tall to superhuman, is the finding that matters. Goliath grew in the transmission. The direction of growth was always toward more impressive, never toward less. The tradition amplified the giant in the retelling. This is not evidence of dishonesty, it's evidence of how memory and tradition work. The story needed the giant to be large enough to make the victory meaningful. As the tradition accumulated, as the story was told and retold, the size of the giant adjusted to meet the theological need. By the time the Masoretic tradition crystallized, Goliath was 9 feet 9, and the story had reached its maximum dramatic weight. But what this tells us about the broader tradition of the Nephilim and the giants, about the Rephaim and the Emim and the Zamzumim and Og's 9-cubit bed, is suggestive. Every element of that tradition was subject to the same pressures of amplification over time. The things that needed to be large became larger in the retelling. The tradition shaped the size of what it remembered in the direction of what the memory needed them to be. The giants grew, and the growing is part of the tradition, not a corruption of it. One thing the 1 Enoch passage does that tends to be lost in summary. It explains why the evil spirits hunger. The giants, in life, ate. They consumed. Their appetite for food was one of the features of the tradition that made them destructive. They ate everything, and when the food ran out, they turned to other sources. After the flood, the spirits retain the hunger. The text is specific. They hunger and thirst, but they cannot eat or drink, because there is no body to receive food and drink. The hunger is real. The capacity to satisfy it is gone. This is a remarkably precise kind of suffering, not the dramatic suffering of fire or darkness or imprisonment, though those are elsewhere in the tradition, but the particular suffering of a need that can never be met, an appetite without the capacity to fill it, a drive that operates without the mechanism to fulfill it. The giants in life were beings of enormous, insatiable appetite. The spirits of the giants after death are beings of enormous, permanently insatiable appetite. The condition is the same. The ability to address the condition has been removed. In the ancient imagination, this was not a metaphor. It was a literal description, but it resonates with anyone who has ever had a need that had no available answer, a hunger that had no food it could reach. Let the room be what it is, the lamp lower than it was, the scroll still open on the table, those 3 words still in the middle of the line where someone left them. We're coming back up now. It's time to lay out, plainly, what we actually know, and what the honest answer to tonight's question looks like. Because the answer is better than anything we've said so far, and it was found by someone 22 centuries ago, sitting in a room not unlike this one. The Book of Jubilees is less well known than the Book of Enoch, and less discussed than it should be. It's another Second Temple text, probably composed in the 2nd century BC, possibly by the same community or communities that produced some of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and it presents itself as a retelling of Genesis and the early chapters of Exodus, delivered to Moses on Sinai by an angel. It fills in gaps. It answers questions that Genesis leaves open. It has a marked preference for logical consistency. In chapter 10, it addresses the problem we've been following all night, directly, with arithmetic. After the flood, the text says, "The spirits of the giants, the Nephilim, now without bodies, begin afflicting Noah's descendants, leading them astray, blinding them, harming them. The unclean spirits of the dead giants are, in the world of Jubilees, causing Noah problems. And Noah prays to God for relief. God hears the prayer. The instruction comes down, bind all the spirits, remove them. The problem is about to be solved. And then the adversary, called Mastema in Jubilees, a figure that later tradition would develop into the concept of Satan, intercedes. Leave me some, he says. Not all of them. Leave me a fraction to serve as instruments for my purposes. The petition is granted. 9/10 of the spirits of the giants are bound and sent away. 1/10 is permitted to remain on the earth, under Mastema's authority. 9/10. That's the fraction I planted at 95 minutes. Here is what it means in context. The Book of Jubilees is doing arithmetic on a theological problem. It is working out, carefully and deliberately, how to account for both the effectiveness of the flood and the ongoing presence of spiritual harm in the world after it. The answer it arrives at is a negotiated fraction, not 0, because 0 would mean the world is clean, and visibly it isn't. Tick. Not all of them, because all of them would mean the flood failed completely, and the tradition doesn't want to say that. 9/10 bound, 1/10 remaining. Someone, 22 centuries ago, sat with a theological gap, and solved it with a fraction. What I find remarkable about this, and what I think deserves to be said plainly, is not the specific answer. It's the act of quantifying, of sitting down with an inherited problem and saying, the answer has a number. How much evil persists after the flood? 1/10. Why? Because God heard the prayer and bound the rest. Ancient people solving a plot hole with a fraction. This is the payoff of the Jubilees reading, not the specific cosmological claim, but the evidence of the problem-solving mind at work. Someone cared enough about the inconsistency in the received text to produce a specific arithmetic solution. The fraction is the fingerprint of the attention. And then there's the bed. We went past the bed in Rabbah at about 28 minutes, and I said we would come back for it. We are here. Deuteronomy 3:11 says, Og's bed, iron, 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide, is in the city of Rabbah of the Ammonites. Is it not in Rabbah? The text asks you to go and verify it. Nobody has ever found it. Nobody knows what it was. The city of Rabbah is the city now called Amman, the capital of Jordan, continuously inhabited since the Bronze Age. The layers of occupation built up so thick over 3 millennia that whatever might have been there is buried under everything that came after. The address is real. The city is real. The measurement is specific. And the object is gone. Scripture has handed you a museum label for an exhibit that closed 3,000 years ago. What I keep returning to, more than the question of what the object was, is the act of pointing. The author or editor of Deuteronomy 3:11 felt strongly enough that the audience would want to verify this claim that they provided directions. They believed the thing was real and findable and checkable. They included the city because they expected a reader to go and check. That expectation is 3,000 years old. The person who wrote those words assumed that someone, someday, would try to act on the invitation. And every person who has ever read that verse and thought about following the address, there have been many, across 30 centuries of reading, has been responding to that ancient assumption. Now, let me say clearly what we know and what we don't, because the credibility we've built tonight deserves to be honored at the end of it. What we know is textual. We know that Genesis 6:4 contains the phrase, and also afterward. We know that this is in the Hebrew. We know that Numbers 13 frames the spies' report as a field assessment and includes the observation that they saw the Nephilim. We know that Deuteronomy 2 contains a detailed ethnographic catalogue of tall peoples in specific territories. We know that Deuteronomy 3:11 provides a specific measurement and a specific address for a specific object. We know that the Book of Giants was found in multiple caves at Qumran, in Aramaic, dated to the 2nd century BC. We know that Gilgamesh appears in 4Q53 by name among the giants. We know that the dream of the wiped tablet is in the fragments. We know that 1 Enoch 15-16 offers a specific explanation of how giant spirits survive the death of the body. We know that Jubilees 10 presents the 9/10 binding as the resolution of the post-flood spirit problem. We know that 4Q Sama, the Septuagint, and Josephus all read Goliath's height as 4 cubits and a span. These are facts, textual facts, but facts. What we don't know, whether any of the events described in these texts happened, whether the Nephilim were real in any historical sense, whether there were humans of extraordinary size in the ancient Near East, whether the spirits of the Nephilim have any correspondence to anything outside the texts that describe them, whether Og's bed was an iron bed frame or a basalt sarcophagus, or a dolmen, or a literary invention, whether the flood is a historical event in the geological sense. The scholarly consensus, for what it's worth, reads the giant traditions as a layered product, theological explanations for human evil, folk memory of peoples who were genuinely large or who felt large to those who encountered them, the literary convention of the massive enemy inherited from the whole ancient Near East, and the accumulated weight of megalithic ruins that no one in the settlement period could explain. The "and also afterward" in Genesis 6:4 is most plausibly a seam, the trace of two traditions that were woven together carefully enough to preserve both, but not quite carefully enough to smooth the join. Mainstream historians and archaeologists treat these traditions as products of their time, theological literature, not historical record. That is the honest assessment, and it deserves to be stated plainly before we name what tonight has actually been about. These are honest answers. They don't require the giants to have been real. They don't require the flood to be geological, and they're probably right. But here is the thing that I think matters most, and it's the thing tonight has been building toward. The books exist. The Book of Giants exists. First Enoch exists. Jubilees exists. They are real documents, written by real people, in real rooms, with real reed pens, on real surfaces. And the specific reason those texts exist, the reason someone in the 2nd century BC decided to write a narrative from inside the giants' experience, to give them names and dreams and a journey and a verdict, is that they were trying to answer a question. The question in tonight's title is not a modern one. It is not a question invented by internet channels or late-night curiosity. It was asked, in Aramaic, more than 22 centuries ago by people who cared enough about the inconsistency to write 3 books trying to close it. And the answer that those books provide, the spirits survive the death of the body, 9/10 are bound, 1/10 remains. The later giants are a different tradition. That answer is not the answer. Not in the historical sense, not in the archaeological sense. But the existence of those books is. The books themselves are the solution. Someone noticed the sentence. Someone couldn't leave the contradiction alone. Someone wrote the sequel, because the original story didn't add up and they couldn't rest until it did. Let me lay out the 3 answers side by side, because they deserve to be seen together before we arrive at the one that I think is most true. The first answer is one Enoch's. The giants survived the flood because they were beings of dual nature, spiritual and physical, and when the flood destroyed the physical half, the spiritual half remained. The spirits of the Nephilim are on the earth. They were there before the flood, and they were there after it, not in the same form but present. This is an internally consistent answer within the cosmological system of one Enoch. It explains the and also afterward, without removing its force. The giants did survive the flood. They survived it by losing their bodies. The second answer is Jubilees. The flood worked, and the spirits of the giants were targeted for binding in the aftermath. 9/10 were bound and removed. 1/10 was permitted to remain, under the authority of the adversary Mastema, as a fraction necessary to account for ongoing evil in the world. This is an arithmetic answer, a precise, quantified solution to the theological problem. It acknowledges both the effectiveness of the flood and the ongoing experience of harm in the world after it, and it proposes a specific ratio that makes both possible. The third answer is the scholarly one. The giant traditions are a layered product, assembled over many centuries from multiple sources. The "and also afterward" is a seam. The tall peoples of Deuteronomy are a separate tradition from the Nephilim of Genesis, preserving the memory of peoples the Israelites encountered in the land. The direction of the Goliath drift tells you what happened to the tradition over time. It amplified. The giants got larger, the stories got more dramatic. What began as a folk memory of encountering formidable peoples in an unfamiliar land became, over centuries of retelling, a full mythology of supernatural beings and their hybrid children. All 3 answers are in some sense true. The first 2 are true as theology. They are genuine, carefully argued responses to a genuine logical gap in received scripture. They tell us that the people who produced them took the problem seriously. The third is true as history. It describes, as accurately as we can, what the evidence suggests about how these traditions actually formed and evolved. But I want to propose a fourth answer, the one that I think is better than any of the three, and that has been implicit in everything we've covered tonight. The books themselves are the answer, not what the books say. The fact that the books exist. The Book of Giants exists. First Enoch exists. Jubilees exists. These are real documents, written by real people, in real rooms, with real ink on real surfaces. They were read by communities of people who cared deeply about the texts they were engaging with. They were copied and preserved and carried across continents. They were found in caves and libraries and distant oasis cities 2,000 years later. And the specific reason they were written, the reason that drives their composition, that explains their existence as much as any theological motivation, is that someone read the, and also afterward in Genesis 6:4, and they noticed it, and they couldn't walk past it. The question in tonight's title was asked, in Aramaic, in the 2nd century BC, by people who had exactly the problem you've been carrying all night. The problem didn't originate with them. It was in the text they inherited. But they were the ones who decided to do something about it. And what they did was right. Whatever you think of the content of these texts, whether you find the Enochic cosmology compelling, or whether you find the arithmetic of Jubilees satisfying, or whether you think the seam theory is the most honest account of what the tradition actually is, the existence of the books tells you something that is true regardless of the framework you prefer. Human beings cannot leave a contradiction alone, not in their inherited stories, not in their family narratives, not in the accounts of the world that have been handed to them. The drive to close the gap, to write the connecting material, to make the account come out even, that drive is ancient and it is universal, and it was operating in full force in the 2nd century BC, when someone sat down in a room and wrote a story about what the giants dreamed the night before the flood. The question waited 3,000 years for tonight. It was asked 2,000 years ago, and the answer, the real answer, is the asking. What is true either way? True in any framework, true regardless of what you believe about the historical reality of giants or floods or divine beings. Real scribes sat in real rooms and made real decisions about what to write. Real hands held real reed pens and made real marks in real ink on real material. The fragments we found at Qumran are the physical residue of those decisions. They are evidence not of giants, but of people who thought about giants seriously enough to write books about them. That is not a lesser claim. It is, I think, a more interesting one. The people who wrote the Book of Giants were doing what writers always do, taking the raw material of an inherited story and making it livable, making it make sense, giving it the consistency that received stories rarely have. They gave the giants dreams because they needed the giants to have interiority, needed to understand, in the way that narrative understanding requires, what it was like to be the thing that everyone knew had ended. They gave Mahaway a journey because they needed the story to have a movement, a figure crossing the distance between what the giants were and what the human world was, carrying the question and returning with the answer. They gave Enoch the knowledge because the tradition said Enoch had been taken, had seen things that humans didn't normally see, had come back with information. Of course the giants would go to Enoch. Of course Mahaway would fly to find him. And in the middle of tonight, at about 1 hour and 2 minutes, when the ancient explanation of 1 Enoch met the ancient arithmetic of Jubilees, something happened that I want to name before we close. 2 texts, from the same broad tradition, composed within perhaps a century of each other, arrived at 2 completely different answers to the same question. 1 Enoch says the spirits of the giants survive because of their dual nature, inheriting the indestructibility of the divine component of their makeup. Jubilees says the spirits were targets for binding in the aftermath, and that a negotiated fraction was permitted to remain. These answers do not agree with each other, and the tradition preserved both. The scribes who collected and copied these texts did not feel compelled to choose between them. They held both answers, let both stand, allowed the tradition to be richer for the disagreement, This is what traditions do when they are working at full capacity. They keep the arguments alive. They do not force resolution before resolution is possible. The story is internally consistent in a way that the source text wasn't tech. And that consistency is the entire point. Whatever else these texts are, they are proof that human beings have always been unable to leave a gap in a story. The drive to close the account, to make the numbers come out even, to write the connecting material, that drive is ancient, and it is ours. And it was in the room with the scribes who wrote these texts as surely as it is in the room with you tonight. You are here because you noticed the sentence. So did they. We do this all the time. Not with giants, or at least not usually with giants, but the thing that produced the Book of Giants, the impulse that made someone sit down in the 2nd century BC and decide that the flood story needed a sequel told from inside the experience of the ones who didn't survive it. That impulse is not ancient, and it is not extinct. Think about the family stories, the ones about your grandparents or your parents, or the version of your family history that gets told at gatherings and has been told long enough that certain parts of it have become smooth from handling. You probably know the sensation of holding one of those stories up to the light and noticing a seam, a version that doesn't quite account for something that actually happened, a narrative that seems to have skipped something or joined two things that don't quite fit. What do you do with that? What does anyone do with that? You fill in the gap. You write the connecting material, not always consciously, not always deliberately. You fill it in the way water fills a crack. The pressure is so natural that you don't experience it as a choice. The family story that doesn't account for something that happened quietly acquires, over a generation or two, an account of what happened arrived at by inference and instinct, and the fundamental human refusal to let a gap stay open. The national stories do this. The religious stories do this. The stories we tell about our own lives do this. We are constantly, quietly editing the account of ourselves, filling in the places where the narrative didn't quite come out even, making it cohere in the way that events rarely actually cohere. We are all writing sequels to stories we inherited. The giants are a very old example of this. Perhaps the oldest surviving example I know of. Someone noticed a gap in a story they held sacred, and they wrote 3 books in response. The gap is still there. And also afterward, is still in Genesis 6:4, exactly where it was, right where someone left it. But now, if you want to, you can read what the people who noticed it 3,000 years ago thought about it, what they said to each other, how they filled it in. That is remarkable. The strangeness of the archive, if you let it hit you, that you can go tonight to an online translation or a library database and read what a scribe at Qumran was reading in the 2nd century BC. The years between you are approximately 22 centuries, and you can reach across them to find the question you both noticed. You are not the first person to stop at that sentence. You are not the first to feel the pull of it. You are in a very long line of people who noticed and could not walk past. And the books that line produced are still here. Before you sleep tonight, I want to say something simple. Thank you for spending this hour, or these 2 hours, or whatever piece of the night this was, in the company of these questions. It matters more than you know that you are here. If this is the kind of night you come here for, the slow ones, the ones that follow a thread all the way down without hurrying it, then a quiet tap-on like helps the algorithm find more people who need this. And if you have a thought about what we covered, or a question about something we didn't get to, or simply want to tell me what hour it is where you are, that's what the comments are for. I'll be there in the morning. If this is the kind of thing you want to find here week after week, subscribe if you haven't. Or if you want to come along for the longer conversations, the ones that stay with these texts and these questions, you can find what that looks like in the membership link. But all of that is optional. Completely optional. Resting here, at this hour, with the night quiet around you, that is already more than enough. Now, there is a scroll on a table. A room cut into rock, cool even in summer. A single lamp, burning lower than it was when we came in. The shadows in the corners are the kind of shadows that old rooms accumulate. Not threatening, just old, full of the particular weight of how long things have been still in a place. The scroll is open to the 6th chapter of Genesis, the passage about the sons of God and the daughters of men, the Nephilim who were on the earth in those days, the mighty men, the men of renown. And in the middle of the line, 3 words sitting exactly where someone set them down and left them, and also afterward. Whoever wrote those words didn't explain them. They didn't feel the need to. They set the words down and moved on to the next sentence. And the question they left behind has been sitting in that line for 3,000 years, waiting for whoever stops long enough to notice it. Tonight you followed it all the way down. You followed it into Deuteronomy, where someone left an address in a law book, into Numbers, where soldiers reported what they saw in a field assessment, into the caves at Qumran, where a story about the giants' final days survived in fragments smaller than a hand, into the dreams of Ohia and Hahia, where the names were being erased from a tablet in the sky, into the flight of Mahaway across the ends of the earth to find a human being who could explain what was coming, into the careful arithmetic of Jubilees, 9/10 bound, 1/10 remaining, into the answer that one Enoch gave, that what the flood took was the body, and what the flood couldn't take was what came from the Father, and into the real answer, which is simpler and stranger than any of those, that the books exist, that someone sat in a room in the 2nd century BC, read the 3 words in that sentence, and couldn't leave them alone, and also afterward. The question can wait until morning. The scroll can stay where it is, open to that line. The lamp can go out slowly, the way lamps go out, amber going to orange, going to dark, the room settling into the quiet that comes after light. The giants can wait until morning. The bed in Rabbah, wherever it is, has waited 3,000 years already. It can wait until morning. Mahaway has already made his journey. The names that were left on the tablet, the one line that survived the wiping, have always been there. The tradition we've been following is 3,000 years old. The texts are 22 centuries old. The fragments found at Qumran have been in the ground for 2,000 years, and in the scholarly literature for less than 100. The question we started with tonight is older than most of the world's institutions, older than most of its languages, older than the religions that eventually absorbed the texts that contain it. And you noticed the same sentence, not because you were looking for it, not because someone pointed you at it, because you were paying attention, and the sentence was there, and the "and also afterward" caught in your mind the way a small inconsistency always catches when you are genuinely reading rather than just processing. That's what brought the scribes of the Book of Giants to their work too. Not a commission, not a tradition that told them to write it. The same experience you've had tonight, reading something familiar, hitting something that doesn't fit, and being unable to move past it until it makes sense. What makes us different from those scribes is not the experience. The experience is identical. What's different is the framework. We have the seam theory, the manuscript tradition, the carbon dating. We have the ability to hold the problem at a historical distance and describe it accurately as a product of layered editing across many centuries. They didn't have that. They had one text with a gap in it and the obligation to make it cohere. But underneath those different frameworks, the same thing is happening. A story is being held up to the light. A seam is being noticed. And the mind, having noticed, is incapable of letting it go. The giants in the Book of Giants know that what's coming for them cannot be stopped. Mahaway brings back the answer they didn't want. The dream was true. The tablet was being wiped. The flood is coming. And the text doesn't show us what they did with that information. It ends there, with the knowledge in the messenger's hands. We don't see the final hours. We don't see the water rising. We don't see the giants at the end. Maybe that was deliberate. Maybe the author of the Book of Giants knew that the ending was already written. It was in Genesis, it was known, it needed no dramatization. What needed dramatization was the before, the dreams, the fear, the journey, the answer. The ending was always going to be what it was. The before was where the story actually lived. We do this too. The endings of our inherited stories are often fixed. The deaths that happened, the events that can be undone. What we fill in, what we write in the margins and in the sequels and in the quiet hours of remembering, is the before, what it was like, what they felt, what they knew was coming and how they carried it. The giants can wait until morning. The scroll can stay where it is. The world can wait until morning. For now, you can rest.